Whenever someone asks me if they should buy an electric car, the conversation almost always ends up in about the same place. It's a conversation about charging. Which charging network should I use, or which plug does it have? Do I need an adapter, or can I use a Tesla charger? What if the charger I need isn't where I am? They're all reasonable questions, and in fact, they're some of the biggest reasons people still hesitate to buy an EV. And yet, I think something interesting is happening. I think your next electric vehicle is going to feel more like a gas car than today's electric cars do. And not for some of the reasons you're probably thinking, like manufacturers adding fake engine sounds or programming in fake gear changes or otherwise trying to make EVs feel old-fashioned. It's because one of the biggest differences between electric cars and gas cars is finally starting to disappear. Think about filling up a gas car. Have you ever wondered whether the nozzle would fit? Probably not. You don't pull into a station wondering if Shell uses a different connector than Exxon, and you don't keep adapters in your trunk, nor do you feel like you need to check compatibility charts before taking a road trip. You just simply pull in and you grab a nozzle and you start filling up. In fact, it's so ordinary that you've probably never thought about it, but it wasn't always that way. Gas stations weren't always standardized, fuel grades weren't always labeled consistently, and even the shape of the nozzle evolved over time. Somebody had to decide what normal looked like. Today, none of us think about any of that, and I don't think it's because gasoline is somehow a simpler technology. I think it's because we've had more than a century to remove almost every unnecessary decision involved in refueling a car. Electric cars haven't had that luxury. We've spent the better part of the last decade talking about charging speeds, battery chemistry, range, and new technology. But if you've ever tried explaining EV charging to someone who's never owned one, you've probably realized something. Most of the confusion isn't actually about electricity, it's about the choices. Which network, which plug, which app, which adapter, which charger works with which car. The natural assumption is that all of those choices exist because EV technology is still complicated. For a long time, I thought that too, but I don't think that's actually what's happening anymore. Remember buying your first smartphone 15 years ago? Every company seemed to have its own charging cable. You'd go to a friend's house and discover your phone couldn't use their charger. You'd travel with multiple cables and keep extras in your backpack because nobody else's fit. The phones themselves were getting better every year, but owning one still felt, complicated. Then something changed. It didn't happen overnight and nobody suddenly invented the perfect cable, but manufacturers slowly started agreeing on standards. Eventually, we ended up with USB-C. And today, people don't buy a phone because of the connector it uses. In fact, most people barely think about the connector at all. The charging cables simply became invisible. The same thing happened with Wi-Fi. Early Wi-Fi felt like a science project. Getting it working was often harder than actually using it. But today, you walk into a hotel, connect, and move on with your day. Bluetooth followed the same path, and so did things like seatbelts and tire valve stems and OBD2 diagnostic ports. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that every mature technology seems to follow the same path. First, you have to understand it, then you have to remember it, and eventually it becomes standardized, and then one day you just stop thinking about it altogether. That's why I don't think that the North American charging standard is really a story about Tesla or even about charging. NACS is a story about what happens when technology starts growing up. For years, EV charging had required too much thinking. Manufacturers used different plugs. Some stations worked with your car and others didn't, and road trips often started with compatibility instead of destinations. And that doesn't necessarily make electric cars bad, but it does mean we're still early enough in their development that ownership hasn't fully settled. Here's where I think most people end the story. They say NACS or NACS is becoming the standard because it's the better connector. Maybe it is and maybe it's not, but I don't think that's the important part. Suppose someone invented a connector tomorrow that charged 5% faster. Would we replace every charger in North America? Probably not. Because once millions of cars, chargers, businesses, and drivers have all agreed on one standard, compatibility becomes more valuable than small technical improvements. We've seen that over and over again. The winning standard isn't always the technically perfect one, and sometimes it's simply the one everyone can rely on. And I think that's the moment a technology begins disappearing into the background. You no longer wonder if it'll work, you simply expect it to. That's a surprisingly big shift because we usually think technological process means making something better. Sometimes the biggest breakthrough is simply making us think about it less. I mean, think about it. When we're driving a gas car, most of us don't spend time wondering whether the fuel pump in the next town will fit. Electric cars, on the other hand, have simply required more thought when it comes to adding energy, forcing ownership to still require too many decisions. Now imagine buying your first EV 5 years from now. You charge at home, at work, while you're shopping, you stop on a road trip, or you stay at a hotel, or maybe you're visiting family. No matter where you are, you don't think about which connector is waiting for you. Charging slowly becomes something you do instead of something you plan. And that sounds like a small difference, but I don't know that it is. It's funny, but whenever EV ownership becomes easier, people usually assume the battery got better or the charging got faster or maybe the range increased. Sometimes that's true, but just as often, nothing dramatic changed under the skin. Instead, something removed another decision or something you had to remember. It wasn't that the technology changed, it was that the ownership experience did. That's why I think we're asking the wrong question. People often ask when electric cars will finally become mainstream. I don't think the answer is a certain sales number or a certain battery range or even a certain charging speed. I think they'll become mainstream when they stop feeling different. That's to say, when charging becomes something you barely think about or when adding energy becomes as ordinary as filling up a gas car. Shifting toward a universal charging standard is one of the ways we get there. So, yeah, your next EV really will feel more like a gas car, but not because it sounds like one or because it shifts like one. It'll feel more like a gas car because owning it won't ask nearly as much of you. The most successful technologies don't demand our attention forever. They earn our trust until we stop thinking about them at all. And if history is any guide, I think that's exactly where EVs are headed. This is Wrench and Reason, where we explain how modern cars actually work. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.